Jalen Merritt stepped into Summit Kicks with a sense of excitement and pride. Finally, the day had come, the day he could buy the shoes he had been saving for months to purchase. The store was filled with the scent of fresh leather and rubber. With sleek sneakers illuminated by modern LED lighting, the latest sneaker releases were on display. But Jalen wasn't here to browse. He had a clear goal, the Nike Zoom X Pro. Black with blue accents, the perfect pair to enhance his agility on the basketball court. Jalen had been waiting for this moment for a long time. He had spent hours researching, watching reviews online, and comparing every little detail to make sure this was the pair he wanted. And now, as he stepped into the store, he felt a rush of excitement mixed with pride because this was his hard-earned money he made by mowing lawns, running errands, and washing cars on weekends. The store wasn't too crowded. A few customers browsed the shelves. Some tried on shoes, but no one paid much attention to him, except for one person. Meredith Langley, the store manager, had been watching Jalen from the moment he walked in, standing stiffly behind the counter. Her sharp gaze followed his every movement. With years of retail experience, Meredith believed she could recognize trouble when she saw it. And to her, Jalen fit the profile: a 16-year-old boy, tall and lean, dark-skinned, wearing a hoodie with his hands in his pockets. In Meredith's mind, he looked just like the teenagers she had seen in security footage, stuffing sneakers under their sweatshirts before making a run for it. She wasn't going to let that happen on her watch, but Jalen paid no attention to her scrutiny. He moved slowly through the store, lightly brushing his fingers over the sleek sneakers as if he were feeling their texture. When he reached the display featuring the Nike Zoom X Pro, he stopped. The LED lights reflected off the price tag: $230. It was a lot of money, but every dollar was his own. Jalen crouched down, picked up the shoe, and turned it over in his hands. Examining every detail, he imagined himself on the court, feeling the grip of the sole as he maneuvered past defenders, executing quick, precise moves. He wasn't just buying a pair of shoes, he was investing in his passion. Just as Jalen prepared to take the shoes to the checkout counter, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Do you need help with something?" Jalen looked up, blinking at the woman standing before him. It was Meredith, arms crossed, her tone devoid of warmth. This wasn't the friendly kind of, "Do you need help?" It was the kind that implied something else. "I don't trust you." Jalen glanced around. Other customers were present, but she wasn't talking to them, only him, keeping his expression neutral. He replied, "I'm good." Jalen Merritt stepped into Summit Kicks with a sense of excitement and pride. Finally, the day had come, the day he could buy the shoes he had been saving for months to purchase. The store was filled with the scent of fresh leather and rubber. With sleek sneakers illuminated by modern LED lighting, the latest sneaker releases were on display. But Jalen wasn't here to browse. He had a clear goal, the Nike Zoom X Pro. Black with blue accents, the perfect pair to enhance his agility on the basketball court. Jalen had been waiting for this moment for a long time. He had spent hours researching, watching reviews online, and comparing every little detail to make sure this was the pair he wanted. And now, as he stepped into the store, he felt a rush of excitement mixed with pride because this was his hard-earned money he made by mowing lawns, running errands, and washing cars on weekends. The store wasn't too crowded. A few customers browsed the shelves. Some tried on shoes, but no one paid much attention to him, except for one person. Meredith Langley, the store manager, had been watching Jalen from the moment he walked in, standing stiffly behind the counter. Her sharp gaze followed his every movement. With years of retail experience, Meredith believed she could recognize trouble when she saw it. And to her, Jalen fit the profile: a 16-year-old boy, tall and lean, dark-skinned, wearing a hoodie with his hands in his pockets. In Meredith's mind, he looked just like the teenagers she had seen in security footage, stuffing sneakers under their sweatshirts before making a run for it. She wasn't going to let that happen on her watch, but Jalen paid no attention to her scrutiny. He moved slowly through the store, lightly brushing his fingers over the sleek sneakers as if he were feeling their texture. When he reached the display featuring the Nike Zoom X Pro, he stopped. The LED lights reflected off the price tag -$230. It was a lot of money, but every dollar was his own. Jalen crouched down, picked up the shoe, and turned it over in his hands. Examining every detail, he imagined himself on the court, feeling the grip of the sole as he maneuvered past defenders, executing quick, precise moves. He wasn't just buying a pair of shoes, he was investing in his passion just as Jalen prepared to take the shoes to the checkout counter. A sharp voice cut through the air. "Do you need help with something?" Jalen looked up, blinking at the woman standing before him. It was Meredith, arms crossed, her tone devoid of warmth. This wasn't the friendly kind of, "Do you need help?" It was the kind that implied something else. "I don't trust you." Jalen glanced around. Other customers were present, but she wasn't talking to them, only him, keeping his expression neutral. He replied, "I'm good." Meredith Langley had spent years in retail, and she believed she could recognize trouble when she saw it. And in her mind, Jalen Merritt fit the description as Jalen stood at the counter. His patience was wearing thin. He had walked into the store with a purpose, to buy a pair of shoes he had saved up for. But now, he found himself in an all-too-familiar situation. Meredith stood firm, her expression unwavering. "Empty your pockets," she repeated. Jalen took a deep breath. He knew exactly what was happening. He had seen it before, experienced it before, and he also knew how it would play out if he reacted the way she expected him to. If he argued, if he raised his voice, if he showed even the slightest frustration, he would become the aggressor. He refused to give her that power. Slowly and deliberately, Jalen reached into his pockets. He pulled out his phone, his wallet, and his house key, placing them on the counter. "There," he said, his voice calm but firm. Meredith's eyes flicked to the items, but she still didn't back down. "Turn him inside out." A few customers shifted uncomfortably. The young cashier behind the counter looked horrified. A murmur rippled through the store. Even those who had initially ignored the exchange now sensed that something was off. Jalen exhaled sharply, shaking his head in disbelief. "Are you serious?" Meredith crossed her arms. "If you haven't taken anything, it won't be a problem." Jalen clenched his jaw. He wanted to shout, to demand why she was targeting him when others in the store had their hands in their pockets too. But he held himself back. Instead, he did something that Meredith wasn't expecting. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. Meredith's smirk faltered just slightly. "Who are you calling?" Jalen ignored her. He simply raised the phone to his ear and waited. The store remained silent, the tension thick in the air. And then, through the quiet, the sound of heels clicking against the pavement outside cut through. A moment later, the boutique's glass door swung open. Celeste Merritt stepped inside, her presence immediately commanding the space. She didn't need to speak. The way she carried herself was enough. The sharp click of her heels against the polished floor was deliberate, controlled at first. Meredith barely spared her a glance, too focused on Jalen, still waiting for him to comply with her demands. But then, the young cashier, her voice barely above a whisper, said, "Miss Merritt." Meredith's head snapped up. Her eyes landed on Celeste. The tailored navy blazer, the silk blouse, the poised posture. This wasn't just another customer. Celeste's gaze swept the store, taking in the scene. She saw the tension in her son's shoulders, the way he stood, composed but simmering with quiet anger. She saw the way the other customers had subtly distanced themselves from the confrontation. And then, finally, she looked at Meredith. Meredith straightened slightly, still unaware of exactly who she was dealing with. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but dismissive. Celeste's expression didn't change. "I believe you already have." The weight of those words made Meredith's lips press into a thin line. Jalen took a step closer to his mother. "She stopped me," he said, his voice even, "accused me of stealing, told me to empty my pockets. And when I did, she asked me to turn him inside out." Celeste's face remained unreadable, but her eyes darkened slightly. She turned to Meredith. "Is that so?" Meredith squared her shoulders. suddenly more aware of the many eyes watching. "We have a responsibility to prevent theft," she said. "He was acting suspiciously. It's standard protocol." Celeste arched an eyebrow. "And what exactly did he do that made you suspicious?" Meredith hesitated. "He was lingering around the shelves, checking prices, watching other customers." Jalen let out a short laugh. "That's called shopping." A few people murmured in agreement. Meredith's jaw tightened. "I don't have to explain myself to you." Celeste smiled. But there was no warmth in it. "Actually, you do," Meredith scoffed. "I don't know who you think you are." "But," Celeste cut her off. "You don't know who I am." For the first time, Meredith hesitated. That brief pause was all it took for doubt to creep in. Jalen crossed his arms, letting the silence stretch just long enough before delivering the final blow. "She owns this place." Meredith's eyes flickered. A few employees exchanged glances. The young cashier, still frozen behind the counter, looked like she wished she could disappear. "That's impossible." Meredith scoffed, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. Celeste reached into her purse. Pulling out a leather card holder, she flipped it open, revealing an ID with her name and title. "Founder and CEO." Meredith stared at it, then at Jalen, then back at Celeste. The realization hit all at once. Celeste Merritt. The same name printed on every Summit Kicks business card. The same woman whose framed portrait hung in the back office. An office Meredith had walked past every single day. The color drained from Meredith's face. Celeste took a slow step forward. "How long have you worked here?" Meredith swallowed. 3 years. Celeste tilted her head. 3 years. And in all that time, you never thought to learn who signs your paychecks? Meredith opened her mouth, then closed it. There was no good answer. Jalen watched his mother closely. He knew what was coming next. But Meredith had no idea. The store remained dead silent, every pair of eyes flicking between Celeste and Meredith, waiting to see how this would end. Meredith's mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. The cracks in her confidence were showing now. She was beginning to understand the gravity of her mistake. Celeste, on the other hand, was in complete control. She took her time, letting the weight of the moment settle. 3 years, she repeated, her voice smooth, deliberate. "And in those 3 years, how many times have you stopped a customer and accused them of stealing?" Meredith's lips pressed into a thin line. Celeste didn't let her escape. "I asked you a question." Meredith finally forced herself to speak. "Only when necessary." Celeste nodded slowly, as if considering the answer. "And my son? What made him necessary?" Meredith Langley's throat bobbed as she struggled to find an answer. But Celeste wasn't finished. Not even close. The store was dead silent, every pair of eyes flicking between Celeste and Meredith, waiting to see what would happen next. Meredith opened her mouth slightly, but nothing came out. Jalen could see it now, the cracks in her confidence, the slow realization sinking in. Celeste, on the other hand, remained composed, completely in control of the moment. 3 years. Celeste repeated, her voice smooth and deliberate. "And in those 3 years, how many times have you stopped a customer and accused them of stealing?" Meredith hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Only when necessary." Celeste nodded slowly, as if considering the answer. "And my son? What made him necessary?" The air in the store felt heavier. Jalen could see the way some customers shifted, some leaning in closer, others looking away like they didn't want to get involved. But nobody left. Meredith straightened, desperately clinging to what little authority she had left. "Like I said, he was acting suspiciously." Celeste tilted her head slightly. "How?" The question was sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. Meredith hesitated, but only for a second. "He was looking around too much." Jalen let out a short laugh. "Looking around? In a store?" Celeste remained unreadable. She simply kept her gaze locked onto Meredith. "Anything else?" Meredith shifted her weight uncomfortably. He had his hands in his pockets. Celeste exhaled a quiet, measured breath. So did the man by the Jordan section. Meredith had nothing to say to that. Celeste let the silence stretch before speaking again. "So just to be clear, you profiled my son, publicly humiliated him, and threatened him with security." All because he was looking at shoes and had his hands in his pockets. Meredith's throat bobbed. She was running out of ground to stand on. And she knew it. Jalen watched as a few customers exchanged glances. The young cashier behind the counter looked horrified. Meredith finally shook her head. Look, I was just doing my job. Celeste let out a quiet chuckle, one that wasn't amused. Your job? She took another step forward, her voice dropping just slightly. Let me tell you what your job is. She turned to the cashier. What's your name? The girl stiffened. Tasha. Celeste nodded. Tasha, when a customer walks in. What's your job? Tasha glanced at Meredith, then back at Celeste. To help them. Celeste nodded again, approving. And if they're interested in buying something? Tasha cleared her throat. We make sure they find the right size, answer any questions, and give them a good experience so they come back. Exactly. Celeste's gaze flicked back to Meredith. That's your job, not to stand there playing security guard based on nothing but your own assumptions. Meredith's face had gone pale. Her mouth set in a hard line. Celeste inhaled deeply, then exhaled. So tell me, Meredith, do you think you did your job today? Meredith blinked. For the first time, she looked small, but Celeste wasn't finished. Meredith's lips parted slightly as if she wanted to answer. But she hesitated. For the first time since this confrontation began, she seemed to understand the weight of what she had done. Celeste let the silence drag, her expression unreadable. Then finally, she spoke. I built this business from the ground up, she said, her voice even, but with an edge to it, something sharper beneath the surface. And I hired people under one condition, that they treat every customer with the same level of respect. Every single one. She took a step forward, and Meredith instinctively stepped back. Tell me, Meredith, Celeste continued, do you think you represented this store today? Do you think you upheld the values of Summit Kicks? Meredith's throat bobbed as she struggled to find an answer. I made a mistake. Jalen exhaled quietly. He almost laughed. That was the best she could do. Celeste's expression didn't soften. A mistake? She repeated slowly, as if tasting the word. Do you know how many times people like you get to call this a mistake and move on? Do you know how many kids like my son don't get that same courtesy? Meredith had nothing to say. Celeste turned her gaze to the cashier. Tasha. Tasha straightened. Yes, Mom. What do you think should happen to an employee who publicly humiliates a paying customer based on nothing but their own prejudice? Tasha's eyes widened slightly. She hesitated, but only for a second. Then, glancing at Meredith, she said quietly, they shouldn't be working here. Celeste nodded slowly. Then she looked back at Meredith. Meredith's face twisted. Wait, you can't be serious. Celeste raised an eyebrow. You work in retail, Meredith. You know how this goes. Customer service is about trust. If a customer doesn't feel welcome in my store, they won't come back. Meredith's hands balled into fists. I've worked here for 3 years. 3 years too long. Apparently, Celeste's tone was almost casual. You didn't just embarrass my son. You embarrassed my store. You embarrassed yourself. Meredith opened her mouth, but Jalen spoke before she could. It's funny, though. His voice was calm, steady. You were real confident when you thought I was just some random kid. But now you're nervous. Meredith glared at him. I'm not nervous. Jalen tilted his head slightly. Yeah, then why do you look like you want to throw up? A few customers snickered. Even Tasha's lips twitched. Celeste exhaled, adjusting her blazer. Meredith, I'll make this easy for you. You can leave now, or I can call security and have you escorted out. Meredith's face turned red. You can't just. Celeste lifted a single finger. I can. Meredith's eyes darted around the store, looking for sympathy, for someone to defend her. But nobody did. Slowly, she grabbed her bag from behind the counter. Her movements stiff, jerky. She turned, hesitating one last time. Celeste didn't say another word. She simply folded her arms and waited. Meredith walked toward the door. She didn't storm out. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. But the moment she stepped outside, the store let out a collective breath. Someone near the back muttered, "About time." Jalen turned to his mom. shaking his head. "I didn't even want all this. I just wanted my shoes." Celeste gave him a small smile. "Then let's get your shoes." Meredith Langley stood staring at Jalen, her expression tense, suspicious, but also subtly uncertain. Jalen remained composed, meeting her gaze with calm resolve. Meredith couldn't decipher the meaning behind Jalen's sudden phone call, and the ambiguity of it made her increasingly uncomfortable. She tried not to show her unease, maintaining her posture with crossed arms, attempting to project confidence. But the calm assurance in Jalen's manner troubled her more than she'd like to admit inside Summit Kicks. The atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The previous hum of casual browsing had vanished, replaced by an oppressive silence. Customers discreetly exchanged glances, unsure how to respond, yet irresistibly drawn to the unfolding confrontation. Meredith, however, refused to acknowledge this shift. Her eyes locked onto Jalen, stubbornly clinging to her authority. Convinced she was still in control, the silence was abruptly broken by a distinct sound from outside, the clicking of high heels steadily approaching the store. The sharp, clear taps echoed deliberately against the pavement, each step authoritative, unwavering. Meredith didn't immediately register the significance of this sound, but Jalen visibly relaxed, the tension easing from his shoulders. He knew exactly who was coming, and her arrival would fundamentally alter the balance of power. The glass door chimed softly as it swung open, allowing a woman to step gracefully into the store. Celeste Merritt entered, instantly commanding attention, her presence assertive and dignified. She paused briefly just inside the entrance, scanning the scene calmly yet purposefully. Her eyes moved slowly from face to face, reading the atmosphere of discomfort, the subtle shifts of customers, and finally rested on her son. Jalen stood behind the counter, calm but tense, clearly upset by something Meredith had done at first. Meredith didn't pay much attention to Celeste. She still considered herself in control, believing she was merely dealing with a minor issue, a young troublemaker trying to make a scene. However, a whisper from the young cashier, "Miss Merritt," immediately sent a chill down Meredith's spine. Her confident expression faltered, doubt clouding her previously unwavering certainty. Celeste Merritt didn't rush. She allowed the silence to deepen, her eyes moving slowly around the room, taking in the situation carefully, the wary customers who subtly moved aside. Her son's clenched jaw, the discomfort on employees' faces. And finally, Meredith, who was clearly unsettled yet desperately attempting to maintain authority. Meredith finally turned her attention toward Celeste, her voice polite but slightly dismissive. "Can I help you with something?" Celeste regarded her steadily, her expression inscrutable but commanding. "Actually, it seems you've already done enough," she replied, voice calm yet authoritative, immediately shifting the power dynamics within the room. Meredith froze, momentarily uncertain. Several customers exchanged concerned looks, sensing a significant shift in power was imminent. It was Jalen who finally broke the tension, his voice steady but layered with controlled anger. "She stopped me, accused me of stealing, and made me empty my pockets. Then she insisted I turn them inside out." Celeste's eyes narrowed slightly, her composed demeanor masking a growing anger beneath the surface. She turned fully toward Meredith, her voice calm yet dangerously sharp. "Is that true?" Meredith straightened, clearly uncomfortable now that the attention was fully on her. "I was simply following store policy," she answered defensively. He looked suspicious. "And it's our standard procedure." Celeste arched an eyebrow skeptically, her gaze unwavering. "Exactly what made him suspicious?" Meredith faltered for a moment, then gathered herself, pushing forward confidently but desperately. "He was looking around too much, checking prices, watching other customers closely." Jalen let out a sarcastic laugh, shaking his head slightly. "That's called shopping," he said, his voice quiet but clear. A murmur of agreement rippled softly through the customers. Meredith stiffened, her voice rising defensively. "I don't need to explain myself to you." Celeste calmly smiled, though there was no warmth behind it. "Actually, you do." Meredith hesitated again, the confidence draining rapidly from her face. Her eyes darted uncertainly toward Celeste. Then back to Jalen. It was then, amidst the silence, that Jalen calmly delivered the final blow. "She owns this place." Meredith's eyes widened in shock and disbelief. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. She stared at Celeste, her previous certainty crumbling rapidly as Celeste quietly retrieved her leather wallet, flipped it open, and showed the identification card clearly stating, Celeste Merritt, founder and CEO, Summit Kicks. A cold realization sank into Meredith, as she recognized the name, the same one she'd seen countless times on business cards, invoices, and even in the framed portrait hanging inside the back office. The confidence she'd held moments earlier dissolved instantly. Her face paled noticeably, embarrassment and regret washing over her. Celeste moved closer, her presence commanding yet calm. "You've worked here for how long?" she asked firmly. Meredith swallowed nervously. 3 years, she answered quietly. Celeste nodded slowly. 3 years, yet you never took the time to learn who signs your paychecks. Meredith opened her mouth to respond, but quickly shut it again. She had no valid response, no defense left to give. Celeste didn't allow her any respite. Continuing sharply, "Tell me, in those 3 years, how often have you stopped customers and accused them of stealing?" Meredith hesitated. Her face flushed deeply with shame. "Only when necessary," she finally muttered weakly. Celeste raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "And my son, what exactly made him necessary?" Meredith shifted uneasily. "As I said, he was behaving suspiciously." Celeste exhaled sharply, clearly unimpressed. "Because he had his hands in his pockets and was looking at shoes?" Meredith couldn't respond. The quiet murmurs of customers echoed around them, their faces expressing disapproval. It was obvious to everyone that Meredith's actions had crossed a line. Celeste took another deliberate step forward, ensuring Meredith understood the gravity of the moment. "Today, you didn't just embarrass my son, you embarrassed yourself. And you tarnished the reputation of this store. Customer service demands trust and respect, neither of which you showed today." Meredith opened her mouth again, clearly trying to find some way out. But Jalen spoke before she could manage another weak excuse. "It's funny," he said softly. "You were confident when you thought I was nobody. Now you look scared." Meredith glared at him, but her defiance was hollow. Celeste lifted a finger, her voice quiet but firm. "Meredith, you have 2 choices. You can leave now, or I can have security escort you out." Meredith glanced around desperately, seeking support, but found none. With tense movements, she grabbed her belongings, stepping toward the exit, defeated and humiliated as she left. Celeste turned toward her son, the calm returning fully to her face. Jalen, feeling the tension finally fading, smiled weakly at his mother. He had stood his ground, and justice had been served. As soon as Celeste Merritt calmly revealed her identity, holding up the sleek leather cardholder displaying the bold letters, "Founder and CEO, Celeste Merritt," the atmosphere inside Summit Kicks shifted dramatically. An unsettling silence swept through the store, replacing the previous whispers of curiosity. All eyes moved quickly between the 2 women standing face to face, awaiting Meredith's reaction to this unexpected revelation. Meredith Langley stood frozen, her expression shifting from disbelief to sheer panic as the full weight of her error finally sank in. Her confidence, which she had clung to fiercely moments before, crumbled into visible uncertainty. Her face paled noticeably, eyes widened in disbelief, and she opened her mouth as if to speak. But no words came out. This woman, whom Meredith had treated dismissively just seconds earlier, wasn't merely a concerned mother, she was Meredith's boss. The woman whose signature appeared on every paycheck she had cashed for the past 3 years. A few customers exchanged astonished glances, quickly realizing the gravity of what they had just witnessed. Jalen stood silently beside his mother, quietly observing Meredith's discomfort, feeling a sense of relief mixed with lingering frustration. He hadn't wanted things to escalate this far. His simple intention was to buy the pair of sneakers he'd been eyeing for months. Instead, He found himself at the center of a humiliating scene triggered by Meredith's baseless suspicions. Celeste maintained perfect composure, her expression firm yet controlled. She didn't hurry to break the silence. Instead, she allowed it to linger, deepening Meredith's discomfort. Then she spoke clearly, each word deliberate and precise. "Tell me, Meredith, exactly how long have you worked here?" Meredith swallowed hard, her voice trembling slightly, barely audible as she replied. 3 years. Celeste tilted her head subtly, her eyes narrowing slightly in disappointment. 3 whole years working in my store. And it never once occurred to you to find out who actually signs your paychecks? Meredith visibly flinched at the question. Her previous air of confidence entirely evaporated. Customers exchanged glances, their murmurs quiet yet unmistakably disapproving. Employees behind the counter watched nervously, understanding the gravity of what Meredith had done and its potential consequences. Jalen, meanwhile, remained silent, closely watching his mother handle the situation with dignified restraint. But feeling the tension in his chest slowly begin to ease, Celeste allowed the silence to linger briefly before continuing. Her voice calm but forceful. "So, Meredith, in all your 3 years working here, how many times have you stopped customers and accused them of theft the way you accused my son today?" Meredith shifted uneasily, clearly struggling to justify her actions. Her lips pressed together tightly as she swallowed nervously. Finally, after several tense seconds, she forced herself to answer in a faint, hesitant voice, "Only when necessary." Celeste's eyes never left Meredith's face, unblinking and unwavering. "Then please tell me, what exactly about my son was so suspicious, so alarming, that you felt the need to publicly embarrass and humiliate him?" Meredith gathered what remained of her courage and spoke hesitantly, still trying to justify her actions. "As I mentioned before, he was lingering around the shelves, checking prices excessively, and observing other customers too closely." At this, Jalen couldn't help but let out a quiet, bitter laugh. He shook his head gently, incredulous at Meredith's reasoning. "You realize that's literally call shopping, right?" His comment provoked soft murmurs of agreement among the customers. Meredith's embarrassment deepened, but she still desperately clung to her fading justification. Celeste, unfazed by Meredith's weak explanations, pressed on relentlessly. "And what about the other customers who behave exactly the same way? Do you suspect all of them, too?" Meredith was left speechless, unable to respond. The realization of her bias, and the fact that it was now publicly exposed, hung heavily in the air. Becoming undeniable to everyone present, Celeste stepped forward slowly, reducing the distance between herself and Meredith. Her voice remained steady, but the intensity sharpened distinctly. "Let me make this crystal clear. Today, you singled out my son, accused him without evidence, humiliated him publicly, and even threatened him with security, solely because he was browsing shoes and had his hands in his pockets." Meredith swallowed hard, her expression betraying deep embarrassment. She knew she had no valid excuse left. Around them, the quiet murmurs of disapproval among customers grew more pronounced. Jalen watched carefully, silently appreciating the way his mother was handling this situation. Asserting authority without raising her voice or losing control, Celeste took a breath and stepped closer, her presence commanding the store's full attention. "Meredith," she continued, her voice now softer but no less authoritative, "today you didn't just embarrass my son, you embarrassed yourself, this store, and everyone who works here. Your behavior goes against everything Summit Kicks stands for." The store remained utterly quiet, all eyes still glued to Meredith, waiting anxiously to see how she would react next. The once confident manager now appeared small, powerless, and deeply humiliated. The realization of the consequences of her actions finally seemed to sink in fully after a long, tense silence. Meredith finally lowered her eyes, a clear sign of resignation. She no longer held any authority or moral high ground. The air around them felt heavy with tension, but also relief. As justice had finally prevailed, Celeste exhaled slowly, taking one final step toward Meredith, her voice softer but still resolute. I'll make this clear. You can leave now on your own. Or I will have security escort you out. The choice is yours." Meredith looked around, desperate for support or sympathy, but found none. Defeated, she quietly collected her belongings. Knowing she had lost much more than just her job today, she had lost her dignity. Jalen, standing beside his mother, finally relaxed, feeling a sense of relief. He glanced at Celeste, quietly grateful she had stood firmly by his side. Justice, though bitter, had finally been served. As Meredith grabbed her bag from behind the counter, a strained silence filled Summit Kicks. Every eye in the store followed her slow, awkward steps toward the door. Her confidence, once solid and unshakable, was now utterly broken. She didn't storm out. Instead, she moved stiffly and awkwardly, as though each step required a monumental effort. She refused to give Celeste or Jalen the satisfaction of seeing her lose control completely. But her humiliation was clear and palpable. No one spoke as Meredith made her final exit, the gentle chime of the door signaling her departure. Immediately afterward, the air seemed to lift, replaced by a collective exhale from the customers and staff, a release of tension they'd been holding since the confrontation began. A quiet voice from somewhere in the back whispered, "About time." Capturing the sentiment felt by everyone present, Jalen stood silently next to his mother, his eyes fixed thoughtfully on the spot Meredith had occupied moments earlier. He shook his head slightly, disbelief still lingering in his expression. This wasn't what he'd envisioned when he entered Summit Kicks that day. He'd simply wanted to buy the shoes he'd worked so hard for. But instead, he'd found himself at the center of a distressing scene caused by prejudice. He turned toward Celeste, meeting her calm gaze. "I didn't want all this drama," Jalen admitted quietly, his voice carrying the lingering echoes of frustration. "All I wanted was to buy my shoes and leave peacefully." Celeste placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her expression softening into a sympathetic yet firm smile. "I understand," she said, voice steady but warm, "but sometimes, situations like these force us to face reality. Meredith wasn't accusing you of stealing shoes. She was accusing you of being exactly who she thought you were." Jalen exhaled slowly, absorbing his mother's words. Her wisdom was something he'd grown accustomed to. Yet every time she spoke like this, he felt a deep admiration and gratitude for having someone who truly understood his struggles. He glanced around the store, noting how the customers slowly resumed their shopping, whispering quietly but respectfully among themselves. Even the employees seemed to relax, their movements returning to normal as the tension dissipated. Tasha, the young cashier, cautiously approached the counter again, her expression deeply apologetic. She gently placed the box containing the Nike Zoom X Pros in front of Jalen. "I'm so sorry for what happened," she said sincerely, her voice soft and filled with genuine remorse. "These are yours, and they're on the house." Jalen hesitated for a moment, glancing at his mother for confirmation. Celeste gave Tasha an appreciative nod, quietly acknowledging her gesture of goodwill. Jalen managed a small smile. "Are you sure?" he asked, not entirely comfortable with the idea of accepting something without paying for it. Even under these circumstances, Tasha smiled kindly, nodding firmly. "Absolutely, it's the least we can do." With a grateful sigh, Jalen took the box into his hands, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering frustration. Celeste quietly observed the exchange, her expression thoughtful yet approving. It wasn't about the cost of the shoes, it was about the acknowledgement of what had just happened. It was about taking responsibility, even if in small ways, for the harm that had been caused. As they began walking toward the exit, Celeste glanced around the store one last time, carefully observing how the atmosphere had shifted. The customers had resumed shopping, but many still cast subtle glances toward her and Jalen. Employees continued working, their demeanor respectful yet slightly subdued. Today was an important reminder for everyone present, not just about prejudice, but also about leadership and accountability. Jalen broke the quiet reflection as they stepped outside into the bright sunlight, his voice low but clear. "You know, Mom," he said thoughtfully, The craziest thing about all this is that if you weren't the owner, everything could have ended completely differently. Celeste paused briefly, her expression growing serious. I know, she replied quietly, her voice filled with gentle yet heavy acknowledgement. And that's exactly why it matters so much. Incidents like this happen every single day. Jalen, not every kid who faces what you did today has a parent who can step in and help. He glanced up at her, a question clearly forming in his eyes. So, what happens now? Are you going to change things at Summit Kicks? Celeste's eyes grew determined, her posture straightening slightly as she replied with certainty. Absolutely. This was a wake-up call. I built this company to make people feel welcomed, respected, valued, no matter their race, age, or appearance. Clearly, I have work to do, starting with training our staff to ensure they truly embody the principles we claim to stand for. Jalen nodded thoughtfully, understanding the importance of the moment. This wasn't just about correcting one person's mistake. It was about addressing the deeper issues that allowed it to happen in the first place. As they approached their car, Jalen chuckled softly, shaking his head again, trying to ease the lingering tension. You know, all I really wanted today were these shoes. He joked lightly. Celeste gave him a gentle smile, her mood softening slightly. And you got them, she responded, her voice reassuring and warm. Jalen laughed quietly, finally letting himself relax. Yeah, but at what cost? Celeste's smile faded slightly as she looked seriously at him. It cost Meredith her job. But more importantly, it cost us all a sense of complacency. Sometimes, uncomfortable situations reveal truths we'd rather ignore, but they also offer opportunities to grow. As they stepped outside, Jalen breathed deeply, feeling the sunlight wash away the last remnants of tension. He knew today was more significant than just the shoes he held. Maybe, just maybe, someone in the store today would reflect on this incident and carry that lesson forward, because sometimes all it takes is one moment, one clear moment of truth, to begin changing minds. As the tension within Summit Kicks gradually dissipated, Jalen stood quietly near the counter, gently tapping his fingers on the shoebox that now rested securely in front of him. Beside him stood Celeste, calm and composed as ever, yet her gaze carried a thoughtful intensity that went beyond the moment. Around them, the usual activity of the store slowly returned, customers cautiously resuming their browsing, employees quietly restocking shelves, but something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere. Celeste glanced slowly around the room, her eyes scanning carefully, taking in every detail. Customers seemed absorbed in their tasks, yet subtle glances continued drifting toward her and Jalen. Employees, though back to their tasks, moved with a noticeable respectfulness, as if quietly acknowledging that what had happened today was not just about one isolated event. It was something bigger, something deeper, a clear moment of reckoning that had unfolded right before their eyes beside the counter. Tasha, the young cashier who had witnessed everything, stood hesitantly, watching as Jalen examined the shoebox. Her eyes revealed a genuine sense of remorse for what he had experienced. She felt the sting of embarrassment too, even though she had not been directly involved. Gathering her courage, she stepped forward quietly, speaking in a voice softened by sincerity. I'm really sorry that you had to go through all this. That shouldn't have happened to anyone, especially not here. Jalen looked up, meeting her apologetic gaze with a small nod, acknowledging her sincerity. Yeah, he replied quietly, offering a faint smile. Me too. Celeste watched the brief exchange with approval. Her eyes softened slightly as she observed Tasha, recognizing the young woman's genuine remorse and willingness to correct the wrong. Pulling out her card to pay for the shoes, Celeste was gently interrupted by Tasha, who quickly shook her head with determination. It's okay, Mom, Tasha said, her voice firm yet respectful. This pair is on the house. Jalen raised an eyebrow, surprised by the gesture. He wasn't expecting special treatment, nor did he seek it, even after what he'd just been through. He looked up at Tasha, his expression questioning yet appreciative. You sure about that? Tasha gave him a reassuring smile, her confidence returning as she nodded firmly. Absolutely, it's the least we can do. Celeste regarded Tasha thoughtfully, the corners of her mouth curving slightly upward in a subtle smile. Thank you, she said softly, acknowledging the cashier's kind gesture with genuine gratitude as they turned toward the exit. Walking slowly together, Jalen sighed deeply, glancing back at the store with mixed feelings. He still felt unsettled about the confrontation. Even though it had resolved in his favor, it wasn't about the shoes anymore. It was about the weight of injustice and how quickly things could escalate because of someone else's prejudice. He hadn't sought this moment. He hadn't asked to become the focal point of attention today. He'd simply walked into the store to buy shoes, a simple goal that had suddenly turned complicated once outside. The fresh air and warmth of sunlight felt comforting, easing the lingering tension from his shoulders. Jalen inhaled deeply, absorbing the calmness of the afternoon, though his mind was still reflecting deeply on what had just occurred. Turning to his mother, he spoke softly, voicing a thought that had been troubling him since the confrontation ended. You know what's crazy? If you weren't the owner of this store, things could have gone very differently today. Celeste's expression became more serious, and she nodded slowly, fully understanding the significance of his words. You're right, she replied quietly, her voice thoughtful but firm. And sadly, it happens every day, to countless young people like you. They don't always have someone who can step in and make it right. Jalen sighed again, reflecting quietly on the implications of his mother's words. They walked slowly towards the exit, the bright sunlight waiting just beyond the store's glass doors. Celeste's voice softened further, carrying the weight of both experience and empathy. What happened today isn't just about Meredith losing her job. It's about confronting the underlying prejudices that exist everywhere, even in places we least expect them. The real issue was never about the shoes. It was always about control and the assumptions people like Meredith make about others. Jalen considered her words carefully, letting them sink in as they stepped out into the fresh afternoon air. He paused, holding the box tightly under his arm. So, what's next? Will you change something? Celeste's response was immediate, decisive, and filled with determination. Absolutely. It starts today. I'll make sure our management understands exactly what our values are: respect, trust, and fair treatment for everyone who walks through those doors. We can't allow what happened today to ever happen again. Jalen smiled softly, the frustration he'd felt earlier slowly giving way to hopefulness. It felt reassuring knowing his mother was committed to making meaningful changes. Using today's unpleasant incident to make something better. He realized that what he'd experienced today might serve as a powerful lesson. Not just for Meredith but for everyone present. They reached the exit, sunlight flooding warmly over them as they stepped outside, leaving the tension of the store behind. Jalen chuckled softly, glancing down at the box containing the Nike Zoom X Pro sneakers he'd worked so hard for. You know, in the end, at least I got my shoes, he said lightly, trying to ease the lingering heaviness. Celeste laughed gently in response, her expression finally relaxing into a warm smile. Yes, you did, but more importantly, you stood your ground. You handled it exactly as you needed to, calm, composed, and dignified. Jalen smiled, relief finally replacing any lingering frustration. Today had been difficult, unsettling even, but he'd learned something important. It wasn't just about shoes or one unfair accusation, it was about dignity, resilience, and standing firmly in the face of injustice, because sometimes the most powerful change begins with a single, courageous moment.